The sound Marcus Lee's skull made when it hit the steel gate echoed through the Arizona State Fair Arena like a gunshot. 8,000 people watched in horror as his body crumpled to the dirt, motionless, while the massive black bull, known as 38 Devil, trotted away victorious, steam rising from his heaving flanks in the October desert air. It was 9:23 p.m. on a Saturday night in Phoenix, and the silence that followed was so complete that even the carnival rides outside the arena seemed to stop spinning. 38 Devil was the kind of bull that rodeo legends were made of, 2,000 pounds of pure muscle and rage, a Brahma crossbred whose name struck fear into even the most experienced riders. His black hide bore scars from countless battles, and his yellow eyes held an intelligence that made seasoned cowboys question their career choices. He had thrown 47 riders in his career, and had never been ridden for the full 8 seconds. Tonight, Marcus Lee had become number 48. But this throw was different. This throw would be talked about in Phoenix long after the fair packed up and moved on. Dr. Sarah Chin was grabbing coffee in the Phoenix General Hospital break room when her pager erupted with the trauma alert. She had pulled a double shift and was counting the minutes until she could go home to her apartment in Tempe, but the urgent tone made her forget her exhaustion immediately. "What do we have?" she called out as she ran toward the emergency bay, her coffee forgotten on the counter. "Bull rider, massive head trauma, ETA 3 minutes, shouted Mike Rodriguez, the head nurse who had been working trauma longer than Sarah had been practicing medicine. "Paramedics are saying it's bad, document real bad." Sarah's mind immediately shifted into the focused calm that had gotten her through medical school and 6 years of trauma surgery. She had treated bull riders before. Phoenix was rodeo country, and the injuries came with the territory. Broken ribs, torn shoulders, the occasional concussion. But something about the urgency in Mike's voice told her this was different. The ambulance screamed into the bay at 9:41 p.m., and Sarah's heart sank the moment she saw the patient. The man strapped to the gurney barely looked human anymore. His face was swollen beyond recognition, blood seeping through bandages that the paramedics had applied with desperate efficiency. The monitors showed vitals that made her stomach clench with dread. Marcus Lee, 26 years old, thrown by a bull called 38 Devil. The paramedic rattled off as they rushed through the automatic doors. Direct impact with a steel gate, massive facial fractures, suspected traumatic brain injury. He's been unconscious since impact, pupils fixed and dilated, GCS of 3. Sarah's hands were already moving, checking airways, assessing damage, her training taking over even as part of her mind recoiled from the severity of what she was seeing. She had seen car accidents on the I-10, construction mishaps from Phoenix's building boom, even a few shootings, but this level of trauma from a sporting event was something else entirely. "Get me a CT scan immediately," she barked to the technician. "And call Dr. Martinez, tell him we need neurosurgery down here now. This can't wait." The name Marcus Lee meant nothing to her, but it meant everything to Phoenix. He was local rodeo royalty, a kid who had grown up in the valley and worked his way up through the junior circuits to become one of the top bull riders in the Southwest. His picture hung in half the western stores in the city, and his name was announced at rodeos from Tucson to Flagstaff with the kind of reverence reserved for hometown heroes. But none of that mattered now. Now he was just another trauma case, another broken body that she had to try to put back together. Emma Lee was in her bedroom in Scottsdale, supposedly doing homework, but actually texting her friends about her dad's upcoming ride, when she heard her mother scream from the living room. Rebecca had been watching the live stream of the Arizona State Fair Rodeo, something she had done religiously since their divorce 2 years ago, unable to break the habit of worrying about a man she no longer lived with but could never stop loving. Emma dropped her phone and ran down the hallway, finding her mother standing in front of the television with her hands pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. On the screen, they were replaying the footage in slow motion, Marcus on 38 Devil, the violent throw, the sickening impact with the gate. "Mom, what happened?" Emma's voice was small, scared, the voice of a 12-year-old who already understood that her world had just changed forever. "Your father." Rebecca's voice broke. "There was an accident. He got hurt." The broadcast had cut away immediately after the impact, switching to a commercial while arena medics rushed to Marcus's side. But Emma had seen enough. She had been watching her father ride bulls since she was old enough to understand what he did for a living, had seen him get thrown dozens of times, but she had never seen him not get up. "Is he okay?" Emma asked, even though she could see in her mother's face that he wasn't. Rebecca's phone was already ringing. Phoenix General Hospital, the caller ID read, and her hands shook as she answered. Mrs. Lee? This is Dr. Chun at Phoenix General. Your husband has been brought to our emergency room following an accident at the rodeo. Ex-husband, Rebecca corrected automatically, then immediately hated herself for the distinction that meant nothing in a moment like this. How is he? Is he okay? The pause on the other end of the line lasted an eternity. Mrs. Lee, Marcus has suffered severe injuries. He's currently being prepped for emergency surgery. I need you to come to the hospital immediately. Is there someone who can watch your daughter? Rebecca's legs gave out and she sank onto the couch, the phone trembling against her ear. Emma was staring at her with wide eyes, understanding without words that her father was in serious trouble. I'll be there as soon as I can, Rebecca whispered. She hung up and looked at her daughter, trying to find words that didn't exist for a conversation no parent should ever have to have. How do you tell a child that the person they love most in the world might be dying? How do you explain that sometimes life changes in 8 seconds, that everything you know can disappear in the time it takes for a bull named 38 Devil to throw your father into a steel gate? Pack a bag, baby, Rebecca said finally. We're going to stay with Grandma tonight, and then we're going to the hospital to see Daddy. Emma nodded, tears starting to fall, and Rebecca realized that this was just the beginning of the hardest conversation they would ever have. The Phoenix rodeo community was small and tight-knit, the kind of family forged by shared danger and mutual respect. News of Marcus's accident spread through the circuit faster than wildfire through dry desert grass. By 10 p.m., while Marcus was still in surgery, the waiting room at Phoenix General was filled with cowboys, barrel racers, and rodeo families who had known him since he was a teenager riding junior bulls in Tucson. Jake Morrison was there, still in his riding clothes from the evening's competition. He had been scheduled to ride right after Marcus, and had watched the whole thing happen from behind the chutes. The image of 38 Devil launching Marcus through the air would be burned into his memory forever. I've seen that bull throw riders before, Jake told anyone who would listen. But nothing like this. It was like he knew exactly what he was doing, like he was aiming for that gate. The older cowboys nodded grimly. They all knew bulls like 38 Devil, animals so intelligent and aggressive that they seemed to take personal pleasure in hurting riders. Most bulls bucked because it was their nature, because they wanted the weight off their backs. But some bulls, the smart ones, the dangerous ones, bucked because they wanted to win. Sarah Chun emerged from the trauma bay at 11:15 p.m., her scrubs stained with blood, and her face showing the exhaustion that came with trying to stabilize a patient whose injuries defied easy treatment. She found Rebecca in the waiting room, surrounded by Emma and what looked like half of Phoenix's rodeo community. Mrs. Lee? I'm Dr. Chun. I spoke with you on the phone. Rebecca stood up immediately, Emma clinging to her side. How is he? He's alive, Sarah said, and she could see the relief wash over Rebecca's face even as she prepared to deliver the harder news. We've stabilized him, and he's being prepped for neurosurgery. Dr. Martinez is the best we have, and he's going to do everything possible. But, Rebecca asked because there was always a but in conversations like this. Marcus has suffered severe traumatic brain injury. We won't know the full extent until after surgery, but I need you to understand that this is very serious. Even if the surgery goes perfectly, he has a long road ahead of him. Emma looked up at her mother with tears streaming down her face. Is Daddy going to die? Sarah knelt down to Emma's level, her voice gentle but honest. We're going to do everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen. Your daddy is very strong, and he's getting the best care possible. It wasn't really an answer, but it was all the answer anyone could give right now. At midnight, while Marcus Lee lay unconscious on an operating table with Dr. Martinez working to repair his shattered skull, 38 Devil stood in his pen behind the arena, calmly eating hay. The bull showed no signs of the violence he had inflicted just hours earlier, no indication that he understood or cared about the human drama playing out because of his actions. To 38 Devil, it had just been another ride, another victory, another 8 seconds that proved he was unbeatable. The fact that this time his victory might cost a man his life was irrelevant to the massive black bull. He was what he was, a force of nature wrapped in muscle and horn and hide, indifferent to human dreams and human pain. The arena workers had already cleaned up the blood and spread fresh dirt over the impact site. By tomorrow night there would be another rodeo, other riders, other bulls. The show would go on because it always did, because that was the nature of the sport that Marcus Lee loved enough to risk everything for. But Phoenix would remember this night. They would remember the sound of breaking bone and the silence that followed. They would remember the way 38 Devil trotted away from Marcus's broken body, like a gladiator leaving the Colosseum. And they would remember that sometimes, in the desert heat and arena lights, 8 seconds can change everything forever. Dr. Martinez emerged from surgery at 4:17 a.m. with the kind of exhaustion that came from 6 hours of trying to put together a puzzle made of bone fragments and brain tissue. His surgical scrubs were stained with blood, and his eyes showed the strain of working under pressure that would have broken lesser surgeons. In the waiting room, Rebecca sat with Emma curled up asleep in her lap, surrounded by family and friends who had maintained a vigil through the long desert night. "Mrs. Lee." Dr. Martinez's voice was gentle, but carried the weight of hard truths. "I'm Dr. Martinez. I just finished operating on Marcus." Rebecca carefully shifted Emma to the chair next to her and stood up, her body stiff from hours of sitting and worrying. Around her, the rodeo community that had filled the waiting room fell silent, everyone understanding that this moment would define everything that came next. "How is he?" The question came out as barely a whisper. Dr. Martinez gestured to a quiet corner of the waiting room, away from the crowd but close enough that Emma could see them. "The surgery went as well as could be expected. We were able to relieve the pressure on his brain and repair most of the skull fractures. His facial injuries were extensive, but they're not life-threatening." Rebecca nodded, trying to process medical terminology that felt foreign and frightening. "But he's going to be okay?" The pause that followed felt like an eternity. "Mrs. Lee, Marcus has suffered what we call a severe traumatic brain injury. We've placed him in a medically induced coma to give his brain time to heal and reduce swelling. Right now, that's the best chance we can give him." "A coma?" Rebecca's voice broke on the word. "For how long?" "That's the difficult part. With brain injuries this severe, we honestly don't know. It could be days, weeks, or longer. Every case is different, and Marcus's brain needs to heal at its own pace." Rebecca felt the world spinning around her, the fluorescent lights of the hospital waiting room suddenly too bright, the smell of antiseptic too strong. Behind her, she could hear Emma stirring in her sleep, and she realized that in a few hours, she would have to explain to her daughter that her father might not wake up for a very long time, if he ever woke up at all. "What happens when he wakes up?" she asked, though part of her was afraid to hear the answer. Dr. Martinez's expression grew even more serious. "Brain injuries are unpredictable. Some patients make remarkable recoveries and return to normal lives. Others face permanent challenges, memory issues, motor function problems, personality changes. We won't know what Marcus's outcome will be until he wakes up, and we can assess his cognitive and physical function." The words hit Rebecca like physical blows. Personality changes. Motor function problems. The possibility that the man who woke up might not be the same man who had called Emma before his ride, who had joked with her about doing something stupid. "Can I see him?" "Of course. But I need to prepare you. He looks very different right now. His face is severely swollen from the injuries, and he's connected to multiple machines. It can be difficult for family members to see." Rebecca nodded, trying to steel herself for what was coming. She looked back at Emma, still asleep in the uncomfortable hospital chair, and made a decision that would haunt her for weeks to come. "I want to see him alone first. Before I bring Emma in." The ICU at Phoenix General was a testament to modern medicine's ability to keep people alive in circumstances that would have been hopeless just decades earlier. Marcus lay in bed number 7, connected to a ventilator that breathed for him, monitors that tracked his heart rate and blood pressure, and 4 lines that fed medication directly into his bloodstream. The steady beep of machines created a rhythm that had become the soundtrack of Rebecca's new reality. But it was seeing Marcus's face that nearly brought her to her knees. The man she had married 10 years ago, divorced 2 years ago, and never stopped loving was barely recognizable. His head was wrapped in bandages, and what she could see of his face was swollen beyond human proportions. His eyes were closed, but even closed they looked different, sunken and surrounded by bruising that extended down to his jawline. "The swelling will go down over the next few days," said Jennifer Walsh, the ICU nurse who had been assigned to Marcus's case. "I know it's shocking to see him like this, but remember that his brain is healing. Every day that passes without complications is a victory." Rebecca approached the bed slowly, afraid to touch him, afraid that any contact might somehow make things worse. The Marcus she knew was always in motion, checking his gear, working with horses, playing catch with Emma in the backyard of their old house. Seeing him completely still, dependent on machines for the most basic functions of life, was almost unbearable. "Can he hear me?" she asked. We don't know for certain, but many patients in comas report later that they could hear family members talking to them. It's always good to talk to him, to let him know you're here. Rebecca pulled up a chair next to the bed and took Marcus's hand, careful to avoid the 4 lines. His skin felt different, cooler, somehow more fragile than she remembered. This was the hand that had held hers on their wedding day, the hand that had touched her face during their last real conversation before the divorce papers were signed, the hand that had taught Emma to throw a baseball. "Hey, cowboy," she whispered, using the nickname she had called him since they first met at a rodeo in Tucson 8 years ago. "Emma's here with me. She's sleeping in the waiting room, but she's been asking about you nonstop. You scared us pretty bad last night." There was no response, no flicker of recognition, just the steady rhythm of the ventilator and the monitors. Rebecca had expected this, but the silence still felt like a rejection, like Marcus was choosing to stay away from them. "The whole rodeo community is here," she continued. "Jake Morrison, the Hendersons, even some of the old-timers from the Tucson circuit. Everyone's pulling for you. Emma wants to see you, but I'm not sure. I don't know how to explain this to her." The morning sun was rising over the Sonoran Desert, painting the hospital windows in shades of gold and red that reminded Rebecca of countless sunrises she had watched with Marcus during their marriage. They used to get up early on weekends and sit on their back patio with coffee, planning their days and their future, never imagining that future might include this sterile room and these terrible machines. Emma woke up at 7:30 a.m., disoriented and scared, calling for her mother in a voice that carried all the confusion and fear of a child whose world had been turned upside down. Rebecca found her in the waiting room, surrounded by cowboys who had spent the night in uncomfortable chairs, all of them keeping vigil for one of their own. "Mom, where were you? Is Daddy okay?" Rebecca knelt down next to Emma's chair, trying to find words that would be honest but not devastating. "Daddy is very sick, baby. The doctors had to do surgery on his head, and now he's sleeping while his brain heals. When will he wake up?" The question every 12-year-old would ask, the question Rebecca had been dreading since her conversation with Dr. Martinez. "We don't know, Em. The doctor said it could be a while." Emma's face crumpled, and Rebecca pulled her into a hug that felt inadequate for the magnitude of what they were facing. Around them, the rodeo community that had become their extended family watched with the quiet sympathy of people who understood that life could change in 8 seconds. "Can I see him?" Emma asked. Rebecca had been dreading this moment, but she also knew that keeping Emma away would be worse than letting her see the truth. "Yes, but he looks very different right now. He's connected to machines that are helping him breathe and get better, and his face is swollen from his injuries. It might be scary." Emma nodded with the solemn maturity that came with being a rodeo kid, someone who had grown up understanding that the sport her father loved was dangerous. "I want to see him." The walk from the waiting room to the ICU felt like miles. Rebecca held Emma's hand, feeling how small and fragile it was in her own, remembering all the times Marcus had held that same hand while teaching Emma to ride, to rope, to face her fears. Now Emma was facing the biggest fear of her young life, and Marcus wasn't there to help her through it. Jennifer Walsh met them at the ICU entrance, her voice gentle and professional. "Emma, your dad looks very different right now, but he's getting the best care possible. The machines you'll see are helping him breathe and monitoring his progress. Do you have any questions before we go in?" Emma shook her head, her jaw set with determination that reminded Rebecca painfully of Marcus. They approached bed number 7 together, and Rebecca watched her daughter's face carefully, ready to take her away if the sight became too overwhelming. But Emma surprised her. Instead of being scared or running away, she walked right up to the bed and took her father's hand, careful to avoid the 4 lines just as Rebecca had done. "Hi, Daddy," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Mom says you're sleeping while your brain gets better. I brought you something." She pulled a small rodeo medal from her pocket, one that Marcus had won at a junior competition years ago and had given to Emma for luck. She placed it carefully on the bedside table, where he would be able to see it when he woke up. "I'm going to come visit you every day until you wake up," Emma continued. "And when you get better, I want you to teach me to ride bulls." Rebecca's heart clenched at the innocent words, at the idea that Emma might want to follow in her father's footsteps into a sport that had nearly killed him. But she also heard the love and determination in her daughter's voice, the refusal to accept that this might be permanent. For the next hour, they sat with Marcus, taking turns talking to him, updating him on school and friends, and the rodeo results he had missed. Emma told him about her upcoming science fair project, about the horse she was learning to barrel race, about her plans for the summer. Rebecca talked about practical things, who was taking care of his horses, how the ranch was doing, the messages of support pouring in from across the rodeo community. Through it all, Marcus remained motionless, breathing only because machines forced air into his lungs, his face a swollen mask that bore little resemblance to the man they both loved. Dr. Chen stopped by during morning rounds, checking Marcus's pupils with a small flashlight and reviewing the monitors that tracked his brain activity. Her expression was professional but not encouraging, and Rebecca found herself reading meaning into every gesture, every pause, every clinical notation. "How is he doing?" Rebecca asked. "His vital signs are stable, which is what we want to see at this stage. The swelling in his brain is slowly decreasing, but it's still too early to make any predictions about his recovery. Is there anything we can do to help him?" Dr. Chen's expression softened slightly. "What you're doing is perfect. Talk to him, play music he likes, bring familiar smells and sounds from home. We don't fully understand how much coma patients can perceive, but there's evidence that familiar voices and sensory input can be beneficial." That afternoon, Rebecca drove back to the house she and Marcus had shared during their marriage, the ranch-style home in Ahwatukee where Emma had taken her first steps and where they had planned to grow old together. She hadn't been inside since the divorce, but she still had a key, and she needed to gather things that might help Marcus find his way back to them. The house felt like a museum of their former life together. Marcus's rodeo trophies still lined the mantel, photos of their family covered the walls, and his favorite chair sat in front of the television where he used to watch rodeo footage and plan his next rides. Rebecca moved through the rooms carefully, gathering items that carried the strongest memories: his favorite cologne, a CD of the country music he loved, the lucky shirt he wore under his protective vest. In Emma's old bedroom, she found the stuffed horse that Marcus had bought for their daughter's first birthday, back when they were young and optimistic and thought their love could overcome anything. She packed it carefully, knowing that Emma might want it during the long days ahead. The hardest part was going through Marcus's rodeo gear. His protective vest hung in the closet, scarred from countless rides and washings. His lucky hat sat on the dresser, shaped by years of wear and sweat and desert sun. His boots stood by the back door, ready for a ride that might never come. Rebecca packed it all, driven by a superstition that having his familiar things nearby might somehow call him back from wherever his mind had gone. She included his favorite coffee mug, the one Emma had made for him in pottery class with "World's Best Dad" painted in crooked letters, and the framed photo of the three of them at last year's Arizona State Fair. The same fair where 38 Devil had changed their lives forever. Back at the hospital, the ICU had taken on the rhythm of a new normal. The rodeo community had organized into shifts, ensuring that someone was always there with Rebecca and Emma. Jake Morrison brought food and coffee, the Henderson family provided transportation, and the older cowboys shared stories about Marcus's early days on the circuit, painting a picture of a young man who had always been willing to risk everything for 8 seconds of glory. "I remember when Marcus first showed up at the Tucson Rodeo," said Bill Crawford, a 70-year-old former bull rider who had become something of a mentor to the younger cowboys. Couldn't have been more than 18, skinny as a rail, but he had that look in his eyes. You know the look, the one that says they'd rather die than quit. Rebecca listened to these stories with mixed emotions. Part of her loved hearing about Marcus's passion and dedication, but another part resented the sport that had taken him away from his family, first through divorce and now through this devastating injury. She had spent years competing with bulls for her husband's attention, and now it seemed like the bulls had won. Emma, on the other hand, absorbed every story with fascination. She asked detailed questions about her father's early rides, his techniques, his victories and failures. Rebecca realized with growing alarm that instead of being turned away from rodeo by her father's accident, Emma seemed more drawn to it than ever. "Promise me you won't try to ride bulls," Rebecca said to Emma during one of their quiet moments in Marcus's room. "Promise me you won't follow your father down this path." Emma looked at her with Marcus's stubborn brown eyes. "I can't promise that, Mom. This is who we are. This is what Dad loves, and it's what I love too." The words cut through Rebecca like a knife, but she also recognized the truth in them. Rodeo wasn't just what Marcus did. It was who he was, who they all were. Even after the divorce, even after all the arguments about danger and responsibility and priorities, she had never been able to fully separate herself from this world of dust and danger and 8-second dreams. As the days passed, Marcus's condition remained unchanged. The swelling in his brain decreased slowly, and his facial injuries began to heal, revealing features that were recognizably his, but somehow different, harder, older, marked by trauma in ways that went beyond the physical. Dr. Martinez reduced his sedation gradually, hoping to see signs of consciousness, but Marcus remained unresponsive. Sometimes patients emerge from comas gradually, Dr. Martinez explained during one of his daily visits. They might show small signs of awareness, moving their fingers, responding to pain, tracking objects with their eyes. We're watching for any indication that Marcus is starting to wake up. But the signs didn't come. Day after day, Marcus lay motionless except for the rise and fall of his chest powered by the ventilator. The monitors continued their steady beeping, the 4 lines continued delivering medication, and the hope that had sustained Rebecca and Emma began to fade into something more like desperate determination. Phoenix continued its daily life around them. The Arizona State Fair packed up and moved on to its next city, taking 38 Devil with it. New stories filled the local news, replacing coverage of Marcus's accident with reports of political campaigns and weather and sports that didn't involve someone's life hanging in the balance. But in room 7 of the ICU at Phoenix General Hospital, time seemed suspended. Rebecca and Emma had created a routine around Marcus's care, reading to him, playing his favorite music, talking about their days and their hopes and their fears. They brought fresh flowers from the garden at their old house, pictures from Emma's school activities, and news from the rodeo circuit that continued without him. The hardest part was the not knowing. Every day brought the possibility that Marcus might wake up, but also the growing reality that he might not. Dr. Martinez was honest about the statistics. Patients who remained in comas beyond a certain point faced increasingly poor prognosis for recovery. But he was also honest about the mysteries of brain injury, about patients who defied medical expectations and fought their way back from conditions that should have been hopeless. The brain is the most complex organ in the human body, he told Rebecca during one of their conversations. We're learning new things about its capacity for healing and adaptation all the time. Marcus is young and strong, and he has every advantage we can give him. But ultimately, his recovery is up to him and whatever inner strength he can draw on. Rebecca clung to those words during the darkest moments, when the beeping of machines and the antiseptic smell of the hospital threatened to overwhelm her hope. She had loved Marcus Lee for 8 years, had been married to him for 6, and had spent the last 2 years trying to convince herself that she could live without him. Now, faced with the possibility that she might actually lose him forever, she realized that some kinds of love never really end. They just go underground, waiting for moments like this to surface with devastating clarity. In the quiet hours after midnight, when Emma was asleep in the reclining chair next to Marcus's bed and the hospital staff moved through their rounds with practiced efficiency, Rebecca would hold Marcus's hand and talk to him about things they had never discussed when he was conscious. She talked about their marriage, their divorce, the regrets that had accumulated between them like dust in an abandoned house. "I never stopped loving you," she whispered into the darkness, words she had never been able to say when he could hear them. "I was angry about the rodeo, about feeling like I was competing with bulls for your attention, but I never stopped loving you. Emma needs you to come back to us. I need you to come back." But Marcus remained silent, breathing only because machines forced him to, existing in a space between life and death that medical science could maintain but not resolve. And in that silence, Rebecca began to understand that sometimes love means waiting without guarantees, hoping without promises, and finding strength in places you never knew existed. Outside the hospital windows, Phoenix settled into the rhythm of another desert night, the city lights stretching across the valley like stars that had fallen to earth. Somewhere out there, 38 Devil was in another arena, throwing another rider, continuing the cycle of 8-second battles between man and beast that defined the sport Marcus loved. But in room 7 of the ICU, time stood still, marked only by the steady beeping of machines and the prayers of a family refusing to let go. 3 weeks into Marcus's coma, Dr. Martinez made an announcement that changed everything. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind of crisp October day that made Phoenix residents remember why they loved the desert, when he arrived at Marcus's bedside with news that Rebecca had been waiting to hear since the night of the accident. "We're going to try reducing his sedation significantly today," Dr. Martinez explained, his voice carrying the cautious optimism that came with years of managing family expectations. "The swelling in his brain has decreased substantially, and his other injuries are healing well. It's time to see if Marcus is ready to start waking up." Rebecca felt her heart leap with a hope she had been afraid to fully embrace. For 3 weeks, she had sat by Marcus's bed, talking to him, reading to him, playing his favorite songs, all while wondering if any part of him could hear her. Emma had returned to school but spent every afternoon and evening at the hospital, doing homework in the uncomfortable chairs and chatting to her unconscious father about her day. "What should we expect?" Rebecca asked, trying to manage her own excitement while preparing for the possibility of disappointment. "Every patient responds differently," Dr. Martinez said carefully. "Some people wake up gradually over days or weeks. Others have more dramatic recoveries. And some—" He let the sentence hang in the air, the unspoken possibility that Marcus might not wake up at all. Throughout the morning, the medical staff reduced the cocktail of sedatives that had kept Marcus in his medically induced coma. Rebecca watched the monitors obsessively, looking for any change in his vital signs, any indication that something was different. Jennifer Walsh, who had become almost like family over the past 3 weeks, checked on them frequently, her professional demeanor softened by genuine care for a patient she had come to know through his family's devotion. "Sometimes it helps to talk to him more during this period," Jennifer suggested. "If he's starting to surface, familiar voices might help guide him back." Rebecca took Marcus's hand, the hand that had become so familiar to her over these weeks of bedside vigils. His face was still swollen but recognizably his own now, the dramatic distortion of the first days replaced by a more subtle alteration of features she knew as well as her own. The ventilator had been replaced with a simple oxygen mask, and she could see his chest rising and falling with his own breathing. "Hey, cowboy," she said, using the endearment that had become her ritual greeting each morning. "The doctors think you might be getting ready to wake up. Emma's at school, but she'll be here this afternoon. She's going to be so excited to see you opening your eyes." For hours, nothing changed. Marcus continued to breathe steadily, his monitors continued their reassuring beeping, but there was no sign that he was any closer to consciousness than he had been the day before. Rebecca found herself staring at his face so intently that she began to imagine movements that weren't there. A flutter of eyelids, a twitch of fingers, the phantom signs of hope that every coma family learned to recognize and dismiss. Emma arrived at 3:30 p.m., as she had every day since returning to school, her backpack full of homework and stories about her day. She had adapted to the hospital routine with the resilience of childhood, treating the ICU as an extension of their home, the medical staff as extended family, and her father's condition as a temporary obstacle rather than a permanent change. "Any signs today?" Emma asked, settling into her usual chair next to Marcus's bed. "Not yet, but Dr. Martinez says it might take time. Why don't you tell him about your day?" Emma launched into a detailed account of her science class, a quiz she had taken in math, and the drama of middle school friendships with the enthusiasm of someone who believed her father was listening to every word. Rebecca watched Marcus's face as Emma talked, searching for any flicker of response to his daughter's voice. It was at 4:17 p.m. that it happened. Emma was in the middle of describing a disagreement with her best friend when Marcus's right index finger twitched. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but Rebecca had been watching so intently that she caught it immediately. "Emma," Rebecca whispered, her heart pounding. "Look at his hand." They both stared at Marcus's right hand, holding their breath, waiting. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then, slowly, deliberately, Marcus's fingers curled slightly, as if he was trying to grasp something. "Dad!" Emma's voice was barely audible. "Dad, can you hear me?" Marcus's eyelids fluttered. Not the involuntary muscle movements they had seen before, but something purposeful, something that suggested awareness behind the closed eyes. Rebecca's hands shook as she pressed the call button for Jennifer, her voice cracking with emotion. "Something's happening." He moved his hand, and his eyes are moving. Jennifer arrived within seconds, followed quickly by Dr. Martinez, who had been in the ICU reviewing other patients. They performed quick neurological tests, checking Marcus's pupils, testing his reflexes, speaking his name and asking him to respond if he could hear them. "Marcus, this is Dr. Martinez. If you can hear me, try to squeeze my hand." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly but unmistakably, Marcus's fingers closed around the doctor's hand. Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face as she watched her ex-husband's first conscious movement in 3 weeks. Emma was bouncing in her chair, whispering, "Come on, Dad, wake up," like a prayer or an incantation. Over the next hour, Marcus's movements became more frequent and purposeful. His eyes opened briefly, though they remained unfocused and confused. He tried to speak but couldn't manage more than unintelligible sounds around the oxygen mask. But he was responding to voices, turning his head toward familiar sounds, showing clear signs that he was fighting his way back to consciousness. "This is very encouraging," Dr. Martinez told Rebecca as they stepped away from the bed to let Marcus rest. "He's showing good motor function and clear awareness of his environment. The next few days will be critical as we assess his cognitive function and speech." Rebecca felt a hope so intense it was almost painful. For 3 weeks, she had lived with the possibility that Marcus might never wake up, might never again be the man she had loved and fought with and divorced and never stopped caring about. Now, seeing him struggle toward consciousness, she realized how much she had been holding back, how much of herself she had protected against the possibility of loss. That evening, as Phoenix settled into another desert sunset, Marcus opened his eyes for longer periods, tracking movement around his room and showing clear recognition when Rebecca or Emma spoke to him. He couldn't speak yet. His throat was raw from weeks of intubation, and his brain was still working to reconnect pathways damaged by trauma, but his eyes followed their voices, and his hand would squeeze theirs when they asked. "Do you know where you are?" Dr. Martinez asked during his evening visit. Marcus's eyes moved around the room, taking in the medical equipment, the hospital bed, the faces of his family. He tried to speak, but could only manage a hoarse whisper that sounded like hospital. "That's right. Do you remember what happened?" Marcus's face clouded with confusion. He looked from Rebecca to Emma to Dr. Martinez, his expression showing the effort of trying to access memories that were either damaged or buried too deep to reach. "It's okay," Rebecca said quickly, taking his hand. "You don't need to remember right now. You were in an accident, but you're safe now and you're getting better." The relief in Marcus's eyes was unmistakable. He squeezed Rebecca's hand and managed to whisper, "Emma? I'm right here, Dad," Emma said, moving closer to the bed. "I've been here every day, talking to you and telling you about school. Did you hear me?" Marcus's eyes filled with tears, the first tears Rebecca had seen him shed in years. He nodded slowly, and she realized that somewhere in his unconscious state, he had been aware of their presence, their voices, their refusal to give up on him. Over the next few days, Marcus's improvement was steady but gradual. His speech returned slowly, starting with single words and progressing to short sentences. His memory was inconsistent. He remembered his name, his daughter, his ex-wife, but the details of his accident remained elusive. He knew he had been hurt, knew it had something to do with bulls, but the specifics of that night at the Arizona State Fair were locked away somewhere his brain couldn't access. Dr. Martinez explained that this was common with traumatic brain injuries. Sometimes memories from around the time of trauma never fully return. It might be a protective mechanism, or it might be permanent damage. The important thing is that his other cognitive functions appear to be intact. Rebecca found herself grateful for Marcus's memory gaps. The thought of him reliving that moment when 38 Devil launched him into the steel gate, the terror and pain of that impact, seemed like unnecessary cruelty. If his brain had chosen to protect him from those memories, she was willing to let them stay buried. "Do you remember our divorce?" she asked him one afternoon, during one of their longer conversations. Marcus looked confused, as if the question didn't make sense. "Divorced? When?" "2 years ago. We signed papers, I moved out, you kept the house." Marcus stared at her with an expression that was part confusion, part pain. "But you're here. You've been here every day." Rebecca felt her heart breaking for reasons she couldn't fully explain. "Yes, I've been here. You're Emma's father, and we still care about you." It became clear over the following days that Marcus's memory of recent years was spotty at best. He remembered their marriage, remembered Emma as a younger child, but the fights that had led to their separation, the legal proceedings, the painful division of their life together. All of that seemed to be gone, wiped away by trauma or protected by a mind that had decided some memories were too painful to preserve. Emma adapted to her father's confusion with the flexibility of childhood, answering his questions about school and friends as if the past 3 weeks in the hospital had been a brief interruption rather than a life-changing crisis. She showed him pictures on her phone, caught him up on her classes and activities, and gradually helped him piece together the 2 years he had lost. "So I live alone now?" Marcus asked one day, the sadness in his voice unmistakable. "Yes," Rebecca said carefully. "We decided we needed some space to figure things out." Marcus nodded slowly, but she could see him struggling to understand how he had let his family slip away. The man waking up in this hospital bed seemed to have none of the restless energy that had driven him from rodeo to rodeo, None of the single-minded focus on 8-second rides that had gradually eroded their marriage. A week after Marcus regained consciousness, Dr. Martinez brought news that everyone had been hoping to hear. I think we can start talking about rehabilitation and discharge planning. Marcus has made remarkable progress, and while he'll need physical therapy and ongoing monitoring, there's no medical reason he can't continue his recovery at home. Rebecca felt a moment of panic at the word home. Which home? Marcus's house, where he had been living alone since their divorce. Her apartment in Scottsdale, where Emma spent weekdays and alternate weekends. The question of where Marcus would go for his recovery opened up all the complicated logistics of their separated lives. I want to take care of him, Emma announced that evening as they discussed the discharge plans. He needs us, Mom. He can't live by himself right now. Rebecca knew Emma was right, but she also knew that caring for Marcus during his recovery would mean stepping back into a life she had worked hard to leave behind. The daily intimacy of medical care, the shared responsibility, the way crisis had a way of erasing the careful boundaries she had constructed around her heart. We'll figure it out, she told Emma, though she had no idea how. That night, as Marcus slept more peacefully than he had since the accident, Rebecca sat in the chair next to his bed and tried to process everything that had changed since that terrible night when 38 Devil had altered their lives forever. 3 weeks ago, she had been a divorced woman trying to build a new life while co-parenting with a man who prioritized rodeo over everything else. Now she was faced with caring for someone who remembered loving her but not losing her, someone who needed her in ways that transcended their legal separation. I know this is complicated, Marcus said softly, his voice startling her out of her thoughts. She hadn't realized he was awake. It's not about complicated, Rebecca said. It's about doing what's right for Emma and what's right for your recovery. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ceiling of his hospital room. I don't remember why we got divorced, but I'm guessing it had something to do with rodeo. Rebecca was surprised by his insight. Among other things, yes. I've been thinking about that a lot, lying here. About the parts one can't remember. And I keep wondering if maybe losing those memories is a gift. What do you mean? Maybe I get a chance to be different this time. Maybe I get to choose who I want to be instead of being trapped by who I was. Rebecca felt tears stinging her eyes at the hope in his voice, at the possibility that trauma might have reset more than just his memories. Marcus, you can't just decide to be a different person. Recovery doesn't work that way. Maybe not, he said, but I can decide what's important to me. And lying in this bed for 3 weeks, listening to you and Emma talk to me, knowing you never gave up on me, that's clarified some things. Outside the hospital window, Phoenix glittered in the desert darkness, 10 million lights marking the homes and dreams and ordinary lives of people who had never been thrown by a bull named 38 Devil. Never had their world reduced to the beeping of machines and the desperate hope that someone they loved would find their way back from the edge of everything. But in room 7 of the ICU, a family was quietly rebuilding itself around the foundation of love that trauma had revealed rather than destroyed. It wouldn't be simple, and it wouldn't erase the years of hurt and misunderstanding that had led to their separation. But it was a beginning, a chance to discover who they might be to each other if they started from a place of gratitude rather than grievance. As Rebecca finally drifted off to sleep in the chair next to Marcus's bed, she realized that sometimes the worst things that happen to us also create the opportunity for the best things, if we're brave enough to recognize the gift hidden inside the trauma. The transition from hospital to home proved more challenging than anyone had anticipated. Marcus's physical recovery was progressing well. His coordination was returning, his speech was clear, and the swelling that had distorted his features had resolved completely. But the cognitive and emotional effects of his brain injury created complications that no amount of medical preparation could have predicted. The first issue was Marcus's complete inability to remember their divorce. Dr. Martinez had warned them that some memories might never return, but Rebecca hadn't anticipated how disorienting it would be to care for someone who remembered loving her but not losing her. Marcus's confusion about their living situation, his assumptions about their relationship, and his genuine bewilderment about why she seemed hesitant to embrace the intimacy he remembered created a tension that filled every interaction. "Why do you pull away when I try to hold your hand?" Marcus asked during his second day home at Rebecca's apartment in Scottsdale. Emma was at school, and they were sitting on the couch reviewing his physical therapy exercises, when he had reached for her hand with the casual affection of a husband rather than an ex-husband. Rebecca struggled to find words that would be honest but not devastating. Marcus, we're divorced. We have been for 2 years. I know you don't remember, but we're not married anymore. The pain that crossed Marcus's face was immediate and profound. But you took care of me in the hospital. You never left my side. You brought me home with you. Because you needed care, and because Emma needed her father close by. That doesn't mean. Rebecca stopped, unable to finish the sentence without being cruel. That doesn't mean you love me anymore, Marcus said quietly, understanding filling his eyes. Rebecca felt her heart breaking all over again. The truth was more complicated than she could explain, even to herself. Watching him fight his way back from the edge of death had reawakened feelings she had spent 2 years trying to bury. But those feelings existed alongside the real reasons for their divorce, the fundamental incompatibilities that wouldn't disappear just because Marcus couldn't remember them. I'll always love you, she said carefully. But love isn't always enough to make a marriage work. Marcus nodded slowly, but she could see him struggling to understand how love could exist alongside separation, how two people who clearly cared about each other could choose to live apart. The second major challenge was Marcus's relationship with Rodeo. The brain injury had affected his spatial reasoning and reaction time in subtle but significant ways. Dr. Martinez had been clear that returning to bull riding was absolutely out of the question, not just for the immediate future, but potentially forever. For a man whose identity had been built around 8-second rides and arena dust, this news was devastating. I keep having dreams about riding, Marcus told Rebecca one morning as they sat on her small patio, watching the sunrise over the Phoenix Mountains. In the dreams, I'm still good at it. I can feel the bull underneath me, I know exactly how to move with him, and I always make the 8 seconds. Rebecca poured him another cup of coffee, noting how his hands still trembled slightly when he was tired. Maybe the dreams are your brain's way of processing what you lost. Or maybe they're telling me what I could get back if I work hard enough. The stubborn determination in his voice frightened Rebecca more than his memory loss or his physical limitations. This was the Marcus she recognized, the man who had never met a challenge he wouldn't face, a risk he wouldn't take. Brain injury might have changed his cognitive function and erased his memories, but it hadn't touched the fundamental recklessness that had always been both his greatest strength and his most dangerous weakness. Marcus, you can't go back to riding bulls. The doctors were very clear about that. The doctors don't understand what rodeo means to me. It's not just what I do, Rebecca. It's who I am. Rebecca wanted to scream that this was exactly the attitude that had destroyed their marriage the first time, but she also understood that for Marcus, the loss of his ability to ride represented something deeper than career limitations. He was mourning the death of his identity, the core of who he had always believed himself to be. Emma's response to her father's condition was a mixture of mature understanding and typical 12-year-old optimism. She had researched traumatic brain injury on the internet with the thoroughness of a medical student, educating herself about recovery timelines and potential complications. But she had also maintained an unwavering belief that her father would eventually return to the rodeo circuit, despite clear medical evidence to the contrary. "Dad's going to ride again," she announced one evening during dinner, as if stating a simple fact rather than expressing a hope. The doctors said his brain injury makes it too dangerous," Rebecca said gently. "Doctors don't know everything. Dad's stronger than they think." Rebecca caught Marcus's eye across the table and saw the gratitude there, the way Emma's faith in his recovery fed something essential in his spirit. But she also saw the dangerous encouragement it provided, the way her daughter's confidence might push him toward decisions that could cost him his life. 2 weeks after Marcus's discharge from the hospital, Jake Morrison stopped by the apartment with news from the rodeo circuit. Marcus had been eager for updates from the world he had been forced to leave behind, and Rebecca had reluctantly agreed to let Jake visit, hoping that seeing his old friend might help Marcus process his new limitations. "How's 38 Devil doing?" Marcus asked, the question Rebecca had been dreading. Jake's expression grew uncomfortable. "Marcus, maybe we shouldn't talk about that bull right now. I need to know, Jake. Did anyone ride him since my accident?" Jake shook his head. "He's thrown 12 riders since Phoenix. Sent 2 more to the hospital, though nothing as serious as what happened to you." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Rebecca could see the wheels turning in his mind, the way he was calculating odds and analyzing technique, even as he sat in her living room with trembling hands and gaps in his memory. "I think I know what I did wrong," Marcus said finally. "I shifted my weight too early in the ride. If I had stayed centered longer, I could have anticipated his spin." The casual way he discussed technical corrections to a ride that had nearly killed him sent a chill down Rebecca's spine. This wasn't theoretical analysis. This was preparation, the mental rehearsal of someone planning to get back on a bull that had already destroyed his life once. "Marcus, you're not going back to riding," Rebecca said firmly. "Even if you could physically handle it, which you can't, that bull nearly killed you." Marcus's eyes flashed with something that looked like the old fire, the competitive spirit that had driven him through 8 years of professional rodeo. "That bull beat me once. That doesn't mean he'll beat me again." Jake looked distinctly uncomfortable, caught between loyalty to his friend and recognition of the reality that everyone except Marcus seemed to accept. "Marcus, man, maybe you should focus on getting your strength back before you start thinking about bulls." "My strength is fine. My memory is fine. My reflexes just need work." Rebecca felt a familiar frustration rising in her chest, the same feeling that had plagued their marriage whenever Marcus's obsession with rodeo overrode basic common sense. Brain injury hadn't changed this fundamental aspect of his personality. If anything, it had intensified his need to prove himself, to overcome the limitation that threatened his identity. That night, after Emma had gone to bed and Jake had left with promises to visit again soon, Rebecca and Marcus had the first real fight since his accident. "You can't seriously be thinking about riding bulls again," Rebecca said as they cleaned up the dinner dishes. "I can't seriously be thinking about giving up the only thing I'm good at," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the edge of defensiveness she remembered too well. "You're good at other things. You're a good father, you know horses, you could train riders or work with stock contractors. There are ways to stay involved in rodeo without risking your life. Those aren't the same thing and you know it. I'm not a trainer or a stock contractor. I'm a bull rider. You were a bull rider. Now you're a brain injury survivor who gets headaches when he's overstimulated and whose hands shake when he's tired." The words came out harsher than Rebecca had intended, but she was frightened by the familiar cycle they seemed to be entering. Once again, Marcus was choosing rodeo over everything else, including his own safety and his family's peace of mind. Marcus stared at her for a long moment, hurt and anger warring in his expression. "Is that how you see me now? As damaged goods? I see you as someone who almost died and got a second chance at life. I see you as someone who could choose to prioritize different things this time. And what if rodeo is what I choose to prioritize? What if getting back on bulls is what makes my life worth living?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with all the history they shared and all the reasons their marriage had failed. Rebecca realized that brain injury might have erased Marcus's memories, but it hadn't changed the fundamental incompatibility that had driven them apart. His need to chase 8-second dreams and her need for a partner who valued security over glory. "Then I guess we're right back where we started," Rebecca said quietly. Over the following weeks, the tension in the apartment grew unbearable. Marcus threw himself into physical therapy with the same obsessive dedication he had once applied to bull riding, pushing his body beyond what his doctors recommended and measuring his progress against an impossible goal. Emma watched her parents circle each other with the wariness of former lovers who had learned that love wasn't enough to bridge fundamental differences. Rebecca found herself trapped between wanting to support Marcus's recovery and needing to protect herself from falling back into patterns that had already broken her heart once. Caring for him had reawakened feelings she thought she had buried, but those feelings existed alongside a clear-eyed understanding of who Marcus was and what he would always choose when forced to decide between family and rodeo. The breaking point came 6 weeks after Marcus's discharge, when Rebecca came home from work to find him in the garage, practicing his grip on a makeshift bull rope tied to a sawhorse. His physical therapy had improved his coordination significantly, and he was moving with something approaching his old fluidity. But watching him prepare to return to the sport that had nearly killed him felt like watching someone load a gun they planned to point at their own head. "What are you doing?" she asked, though the answer was obvious. "Getting ready," Marcus said without stopping his practice routine. "Jake knows a guy with some gentle practice bulls. Nothing like 38 Devil, just some young stock to help me get my timing back." Rebecca felt everything inside her go cold. "You're planning to ride again." "I'm planning to see if I can ride again." "There's a difference." "No, there isn't. Not with you. If you get on one practice bull and feel like you can handle it, you'll want to try a harder one. And then a harder one after that. Eventually, you'll convince yourself you're ready for bulls like 38 Devil again." Marcus finally stopped his practice routine and looked at her directly. "And what if I am ready? What if I can come back from this and be better than I was before?" Rebecca stared at him, seeing both the man she had fallen in love with and the man who had driven her away. Then you'll do it without us. Because I won't watch you destroy yourself again, and I won't let Emma watch it either. The ultimatum surprised them both. Rebecca hadn't planned to draw such a clear line, but she realized as the words left her mouth that they represented a truth she had been avoiding. She could love Marcus Lee, could care for him and support his recovery, but she couldn't enable his self-destruction. So you're saying if I try to ride again, you'll take Emma away from me? I'm saying if you choose bulls over your family again, we won't be here when you get thrown again. And there will be a next time, Marcus. Maybe not with 38 Devil, but with some other bull that's younger and stronger and smarter than you are. Marcus set down the bull rope and walked out of the garage without another word. Rebecca stood alone among the tools and equipment of domestic life, surrounded by the ordinary objects that represented the stability Marcus had never been able to embrace. That night, Marcus slept on the couch, and they barely spoke during Emma's breakfast and school routine. The elephant in the room was too large to ignore but too dangerous to address directly in front of their daughter, who was already showing signs of stress from the tension between her parents. It was Emma who finally forced the conversation that none of them wanted to have. "Are you getting divorced again?" she asked that evening during dinner, her voice small but direct. Rebecca and Marcus looked at each other across the table, both realizing that their 12-year-old had been watching and understanding more than they had given her credit for. "We're trying to figure some things out," Rebecca said carefully. "About Dad riding bulls again," Emma said. It wasn't a question. Marcus reached across the table and took his daughter's hand. I need to know if I can still do the thing I love. I need to know if the accident took that away from me forever." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. "What if it kills you this time?" The simple, direct question cut through all of Marcus's rationalizations and Rebecca's fears to the heart of what they were really discussing. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, looking at his daughter's face and seeing the fear there, the love that was inseparable from terror. "I don't want to die," he said finally. "But I also don't want to live if I can't be who I really am." Emma pulled her hand away from his, her expression becoming cold in a way that reminded Rebecca painfully of herself. "Then I guess you have to decide who you really are. Are you a bull rider, or are you my dad?" She left the table and went to her room, leaving Marcus and Rebecca alone with the weight of a question that had no easy answer. Later that night, after Emma had gone to bed, Marcus and Rebecca sat on her small patio and talked more honestly than they had since his accident. The lights of Phoenix spread out below them, 10 million points of light representing lives that weren't complicated by bulls and brain injuries and the terrible mathematics of love. "I keep thinking about that night," Marcus said. "Not the accident, I still can't remember that. But the time before it, when I called Emma and talked to her like it was just another ride." "You always called her before rides," Rebecca said. "It was your ritual. But I never thought about it being the last time. I never considered that I might not make it home to have breakfast with her the next morning." Rebecca waited, sensing that Marcus was working towards something important. "When I woke up in the hospital and saw you and Emma there, saw how scared you were, I realized that my 8 seconds of glory had cost all of us weeks of hell. That's not who I want to be." Rebecca felt a cautious hope beginning to build in her chest, but she had learned not to trust Marcus's moments of clarity when it came to rodeo. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe it's time to find out who I am when I'm not trying to stay on a bull for 8 seconds. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the distant sounds of the city and feeling the weight of decisions that would define the rest of their lives. Rebecca knew that giving up rodeo wouldn't automatically fix everything between them. There were still years of hurt and misunderstanding to work through, still questions about whether they could build a different kind of life together. But for the first time since Marcus had woken up from his coma, she felt like they might have a chance. 3 months later, Marcus Lee opened a riding school on the outskirts of Phoenix, teaching young cowboys the fundamentals of rodeo while carefully avoiding the bulls that had defined his career. Emma was his first student, and though Rebecca worried about her daughter's interest in rodeo, she had to admit that watching Marcus teach was different from watching him compete. There was patience in his instruction, wisdom earned through trauma, and a focus on safety that had never characterized his own riding. The school was small but successful, drawing students from across Arizona who wanted to learn from someone who understood both the glory and the cost of rodeo life. Marcus found meaning in passing on not just technique but perspective, helping young riders understand that courage and recklessness weren't the same thing. He and Rebecca remarried on a quiet Saturday morning in March, with Emma as their only witness, and a justice of the peace who didn't know about bulls or brain injuries or the long journey back from the edge of everything. It wasn't the same marriage they had before. It was built on different foundations, constructed from materials that had been tested by trauma and found to be stronger than either of them had imagined. 38 Devil continued his career, throwing riders across the Southwest and adding to his legend with each violent 8 seconds. Marcus read about the bull's victories in rodeo magazines, but felt no pull to prove himself against the animal that had nearly killed him. That chapter of his life was closed, not by defeat, but by the understanding that some battles aren't worth winning. If you subscribe to this channel and leave your like, you won't miss any of our stories that show how life can change in 8 seconds, but how love can last much longer than that. On quiet evenings, when the desert heat had faded and Phoenix settled into another peaceful night, Marcus would sit on the patio with Rebecca and Emma, watching the lights of the city and talking about the future they were building together. Sometimes he still dreamed about riding, still felt the phantom sensation of a bull's power beneath him, but those dreams no longer felt like calls to action. They felt like memories of a different man, someone brave and reckless and young, someone he had been honored to be but was no longer afraid to leave behind. The silence that had fallen over the Arizona State Fair Arena that terrible October night had been broken by the sounds of a family learning to love each other differently, more carefully, with the wisdom that comes from understanding how quickly everything can change. It wasn't the ending Marcus had imagined when he was young and invincible, but it was the ending that mattered. The one where love proved stronger than pride, where security mattered more than glory, and where a man learned that the most important 8 seconds of his life weren't measured by a buzzer, but by the moments he chose his family over everything else.